Hello there, so a map needs approval from 2 beatmap nominators before it reaches the qualified section, coming in the forms of a bubble followed by a heart. There's about 70 BNs total, so you'd think finding only 2 of them would be easy. According to most mappers though, you'd be wrong. One of the biggest complaints I hear about the ranking process has to do with its perceived exclusivity. People claim that unknown mappers are helpless when it comes to finding beatmap nominators. Regardless of its quality, trying to rank a map without social connections or a reputation for being a good mapper is near impossible, and it only gets worse when said map is controversial. On the other end of the spectrum, people claim that well-established mappers can find BNs with relative ease. They're already known, and that supposedly allows them to get away with promoting even the most absurd of maps. It's unfair how being known gives a mapper the upper hand in the ranking process over those without reputation. It's like map quality doesn't matter, only the name attached to it does. The exclusive nature of the ranking process is unjust. That's what all struggling mappers say, but let's calm down for a minute and think. Exactly how true are these claims, and what's the reason they come up in the first place? I think the easiest way to answer these questions is to examine one event which surfaced those claims in recent time. Raruchi's, that's how you pronounce it, his map for Camellia's Exit This Earth's Atmosphere. Atmosphere. This map is something different. It's arguably one of the hardest ranked maps in the game, and not for reasons other maps might lead you to expect. Difficulty in most maps comes from consecutive, highly spaced jumps or long stamina draining streams. Exit This Earth's Atmosphere doesn't quite play by those rules though. Yes, spacing is still the factor controlling how its difficulty is calculated, but conventional jumps aren't what cause it to spike. Most of the difficulty comes from this section of the map, which uses stream spacing levels beyond what we're used to. Cross-screen triples is a phrase I would have never imagined myself saying, and I wouldn't even know what to call streams organized in this fashion. Both of these only make up a small portion of the map though. A good deal of its actual difficulty, not necessarily connected to its numerical value, comes about from its slider design. The map takes slider velocity to extremes no other ranked maps can compare to, both with sheer intensity and contrast of different intensities. Because of this, the map can become as much a challenge in mechanical demand as it is with comprehending what's just on screen at times. So yeah, you don't see maps like Exit This Earth's Atmosphere every day. How was its general reception then? Any other mapper and it wouldn't have even been bubbled. That's the highest upvoted comment on the Reddit post announcing this map's acceptance into the ranked category. It implies the idea that Raruchi was only able to push his map through the ranking process because he is Raruchi. He's a famous player whose skill could attest to the outlandish ideas in this map, and more importantly, he's a mapper with over 6 years and over 50 completed maps worth of experience. If a no-name mapper created the same overdone, absurd map, they wouldn't stand a chance in the ranking process. At least, that's what I'm interpreting from the comment here. This idea could explain why the most controversial maps almost always come from the most well-known mappers. I mean, anyone paying attention to the mapping scene has definitely seen the correlation. However, I don't think that's a real reason. It should be obvious, and I feel stupid for even having to spell it out, but the actual reason why the most well-established mappers can promote the most ridiculous maps is because behind the absurdity, there's content that most unknown mappers could only dream of creating. I personally do have some qualms with Raruchi's map here, but I can't deny how masterfully it was crafted. It reflects the smallest details of the music with subtle but recognizable clarity, while also creating a logically sound gameplay experience through clever design choices. Using empty words like that isn't very convincing though. It just proliferates the talk of some vague excuse to circle jerk between known mappers. But I think a lot of people complaining about this problem with the ranking process aren't noticing what makes maps like this worthy of rank above other controversial and ordinary maps. So let's check it up close with regards to those 2 previously mentioned categories, representing the music and clever gameplay enhancing design choices. The map starts out simple. For the first 10 or so seconds, rhythm consists almost entirely of a repetitive metronome, and so the map is, as you should hopefully guess, repetitive. There's 4 groupings of pretty neat animating sliders matching the metronome, separated by objects representing the few variations in the song here. First is a loud synth noise, still in line with the metronome, represented by a slider using a low slider velocity to indicate the severe change. Next is a more dense rhythm involving half and fourth beat synth noises. and the last is the same as the first. All that fits the song in obvious ways, cool. What's more interesting though is the subtle hints Ferrucci provides for players. Like, look at the first grouping here. You've got 3 objects repeating essentially the same thing. The 4th object though is a different rhythm, slightly faster, but visually it's the exact same. So to show there's a change, a new combo is used. It doesn't break the visual pattern, but still tells a player that something's different. That's a common idea to be used throughout the rest of the map as well. The purpose of this rhythm, as I've already explained, is to allow clicking on the synth noise, and the slider representing that has a much lower slider velocity. The stark difference between the 2 speeds effectively tells a player what's to come later in the map. It's going to have massive variations in slider velocity. Good to make that clear early on. The next grouping follows the same concept for the first 3 sliders, but the 4th is a bit different. It's half a beat long as opposed to the previous 3/4 of a beat. To differentiate the two and hint to players that something is changing while still maintaining the same pattern, Ferrucci chose to flip the direction of the slider, forcing rotation in an unexpected way. More unusual movement for a less expected rhythm. Fairly appropriate, I'd say. Following this is another 10-second segment which repeats essentially the same thing, but with the metronome ticking twice as fast. Repeated half-beat sliders are used everywhere, forming simple symmetric and geometric patterns in accordance with basic music theory concepts, while those same 3 variations, the synth stuff, exist with similar slider velocity and rhythm changes. As the song builds up towards the end of the section, spacing changes suitably with this gradually expanding pattern. The gameplay related elements here are actually ones you might have heard me talk about before, since I've made a map entirely out of a similar concept. There are 3 slider rhythms here, those half a beat long, those 3/4 of a beat long, and those 1/4 of a beat long. Each of them has their own visual shape to tell a player that despite being similar in visual length, they're held for different durations of time. Half beat sliders are repeatedly straight lines, a pattern established with the first 7 sliders, while the 8th is 3/4 of a beat long and is curved. Another 6 straight sliders later, and there's 2 sliders 1/4 of a beat long, each with red anchors forming sharp corners. This idea both expresses differences between sliders in the short term, meaning just a section of the song, and also serves as a clue for what will come later. Here is where the song really begins. To show just how much more intense this part is than what a player just experienced, Ferrucci uses slider velocity 4 times higher than the usual for that previous section, introduced through a slight increase in speed with these first 2 sliders. What this section serves to do is establish a normality for the rest of the map. It tells a player, hey, this map is hard with its spacing, slider velocity, and rhythm choice, while also showing what visual style will be used for other sections of the song similar to this. It's not nearly as strict as the last section's 3 types of slider shapes, but it still gives players a clear image of what the map should look like. It uses a bunch of sliders curved different amounts, along with some red anchor and wavy slider variations. Establishing identity. The next section continues most of the same ideas, while also preparing and going through with a build-up. It begins with slightly lower slider velocity than the last section, then steadily builds it up along with the song through to this point, where it slows down to make way for build-up through rhythm instead. It starts out with non-stop 1/4 rhythms, which have their own increase in slider velocity and spacing to continue accounting for the build-up, followed by 1/8 repeating sliders, and finally 1/16 repeating sliders. It's a build-up to the furthest extent the editor allows, which is pretty apt for the situation. How Ferrucci manages the end of the build-up with players in mind is pretty neat actually. One concern with consecutive, extremely short repeating sliders is their hit window. For example, we've got 2 1/16 repeating sliders back to back here, covering all the ticks in the timeline. When moving between the first and the second, there are a maximum of 66 milliseconds available for movement and clicking. A player could leave the area of the slider ball ring as soon as the last reverse is hit, then click the next slider at the moment before its first reverse is hit, and still maintain combo. More likely though, a player will try to click the second object accurately, giving them a 44 millisecond time window to do so, and that might cause players to move away from the first object early enough to break combo. If a player tries following the slider as accurately as possible, that gives them a 22 millisecond window for movement, and that isn't exactly practical. To avoid any of this unfair gameplay, Ferrucci removes 1 or more of the final reverse arrows on each slider. This gives players enough time to release their input key and reasonably move away from an object. Between each 1/8 slider is a 1/4 gap, which is a solid choice given the objects are spaced pretty far apart from each other. Filling in that extra 1/8 tick could lead to combo breaks, or at least unnecessary 100s in some situations. The 1/16 sliders, however, use 1/8 gaps, because they're spaced so closely together. It's easy enough not to break combo between them because there's less area needed to move from one slider into another. The last of these sliders, though, is cut to have a 1/4 gap, because the final circle is placed further away. So basically, the amount of repeats on each slider are chosen chosen according to spacing for the sake of practical playability. I think that's pretty cool. After the break comes a section of entirely circles. Like, for about 20 seconds, it's just continuous circles every half a beat. Usually this would equate to an extremely difficult part of a map, but here it's done to represent one of the calmest and easiest ones. That, paired with the lack of rhythmic contrast, could easily lead to problems, but because these circles are clearly arranged according to pitches of sounds and minor variations in instruments with intensity in mind, it still represents the music effectively. Like, the first combo is arranged in a group of 3 objects and another group of 5 objects. To match the increase in pitches for the first 3 sounds, then larger spacing to hit the peak of 4, followed by the descent of pitches up through object 8. It's also worth mentioning that these pitches are backed by 2 instruments, what sounds like a piano, or bells, I don't know, and some high-pitched synthesizer thing. I'll explain why that matters soon. The next 2 combos serve to emphasize white ticks, since pitch-wise they stand out the most here. A square is a pretty standard way to emphasize sounds in groups of 2 or 4, and the larger spacing for each grouping of 2 in the second combo tells a player that the start of each grouping is relatively important, which the song supports through its highest pitches. The 8 objects after this are stacked in the same position. Musically, it sounds extremely similar to that first combo, but the synth noise is now gone, and Marucci is making the difference clear by not separating it into groups of 3 and 5. The next 2 combos represent the same sounds each, so they're copied, pasted, and rotated versions of the same pattern. The next 2 combos use the same idea for 8 objects rather than 4, and these final groupings of 3 match pitches of the piano/bell thing, while also increasing spacing steadily to fit the increase in pitches in the synth's reintroduction. To avoid just reiterating the same logic, it's better not to dwell on this too much. This alone should make it clear that these aren't nonsensical circles spammed for spiking difficulty. They're not challenging to play, and each has a special purpose in representing the music, despite not being rhythmically variable in any way. What follows this section is essentially the inverse of the last. It focuses entirely on long sliders in fancy slider design, as opposed to dense, repetitive circles. Musically speaking, there's not much to this. As pitches increase, slider velocity does as well. Just being able to show such an extreme difference in parts of the song is something a lot of maps fail to do effectively. Yet by going from this section to this one, there's no question that the map is meant to express different parts of the music. Next is a false buildup. The map increases intensity steadily over 10 seconds through rhythm density and spacing to match the volume increase of the synth instrument, which picks up about halfway through, and ends with an anticlimax in spacing after subtly bumping up slider velocity for these last 2 objects. Essentially, this is just repeating ideas we've already seen in preparation for the chorus coming up soon. Establishing identity. Again, yes. This short segment is like the calm before the storm, using slow sliders and repeated placements to show just how simple it is. When variations in the song appear, they break those repeated placements in extremely obvious ways. This slider is stacked and pointing a different direction from the previous 6 objects because it represents a different sound, while the following object is spaced relatively far away to showcase its importance. You know, spacing emphasis. And here is where the real build-up begins. After a rhythmically dense transition, the map increases slider velocity, spacing, and rhythm density in accordance with the song's pounding bass kick. This build-up is much more important than any of the others though, since it leads into the real climax of the song, which is not coincidentally the hardest part of the map. So, to portray its importance, the build-up this time is a spectacle. It increases intensity with the usual mapping concepts I've already talked about, but does so with flair. This repeated pattern is chaotic with its overlaps, but easy to understand at the same time. Looks pretty cool. These steadily shortening 1/8 sliders move so fast that you can barely tell what's flashing on the screen, but it's still simple enough to follow thanks to its straightforward linear design. It again looks really cool. These last 2 objects are short repeating sliders like we've talked about earlier, but they're not really short visually. These slider shapes and slider velocities are what you'd never be expecting from short repeating sliders. If these sliders were used in that first build-up, they wouldn't be nearly as impactful here, and Marucci definitely knew that when designing this build-up before the chorus. After another low-intensity transition, the chorus actually begins, which is also where most people's concerns lie. This section is hard. Really, really hard. Spacing is inhuman, and slider velocity is variable to degrees I only see in unranked maps. But in spite of that, it's still organized in a way that I can easily interpret and understand. This section of the music repeats itself 4 times with minor variations, and Marucci represents those in ways I imagine most people would overlook. No, I'm not talking about using a spaced triple to express as a high-pitched noise. Stuff like that is too obvious. Instead, let's take these for example. These 5 object groupings repeat themselves in each key section, but in slightly different ways. The first is a highly compressed star, which as scaling out shows, favors movement in one direction, sort of. Percussion here is that same pounding bass kick on the white ticks, with high-pitched synth noises in the middle. These repeat throughout this first fourth of the chorus, then change design in the second fourth. Here, movement doesn't quite have the same sort of rotation thing. Objects are steadily moving in one direction, with some weird separation which actually has a purpose. The drum percussion sounds are on each white tick still, while the synthesizer noises are in between. Why wasn't the first section like this though? Well, in the second chorus, drums change a bit. The first is more of a snare drum impact, while the second is the familiar bass kick. Because the first fourth uses the same drum sounds, I think Horiuchi chose to use continuous movement, while the different drum sounds in the second fourth influenced him to use a less smooth type of movement. Honestly, I wouldn't have even noticed a difference if not for the way the third key section treated drums. Here, the first 3 of the 5 cover synth noises, while the last 2 are drums. To show this, a triangle is used since it's the easiest way to signify a grouping of 3, while the 2 drum sounds are stacked in the same location to show that they are the same sound. A perfect fit in my opinion. And the last of the 4 key sections seems to break this 5-object combo idea, but there's a reason for it. It instead separates objects with some short 1/4 sliders as a tool to once again signify each percussion sound clearly. Here, drums land on the first sound and the 4th sound, while synth noises play on each other sound. There's no easy way to show importance for this sound through circles only, so Horiuchi chose to use common spacing and rhythm conventions to indicate it another way. Each of these are groupings of 3 sounds, and the first of each stands out the most, which clearly lines up with each percussion sound. It's different, but it gets across the same idea. I could go on about similar concepts in the rest of the chorus here, but let's look at what might be more concerning to people. How playable is this? To understate it, spacing is extreme, but it's handled in ways that at least make it manageable to some degree. Like, look at the infamous cross-screen triples. They're higher spacing than anything you could find on other ranked maps, but they're also arranged in a fairly uniform way. Each triple moves in one of the 4 cardinal directions, or up, down, left, or right. Repeating the same type of movement is easy enough for a player to handle and is far more practical than doing so in some random diagonal angle. Doing this is a good choice for playability. Now, look at these other infamous crazily spaced streams. What comes before each one? A slider which requires absolutely no movement. This pause gives players a chance to prepare for a spike in aim requirements, which would be ruined if you did something like 2 1/4 sliders, an idea that would still be appropriate in the context of the map. This was a well-made choice that follows music while still giving ease to the most outrageous of object arrangements. Within these chorus sections is also the resurgence of different concepts which were hinted at earlier. The most obvious of these is the extreme variation in slider velocity, which was introduced immediately in the map. This can be found everywhere, so I shouldn't need to explain it. What's a little more obscure is that slider shape concept I talked about earlier. Horiuchi used slider shapes in the second section to indicate changes in map design, and that carries through to the transition between the 3rd and 4th key sections. Here, the normality established by slider shapes in the few previous sections and continued through the first 3 sections of the key, that identity I was talking about, goes away. Because of the extreme change in slider velocity, which does of course follow the song, slider shapes are designed using entirely red anchors to form tons of jagged angles. They tell a player that something is clearly different, and that's enforced by the ideas that players became accustomed to earlier. And yeah, the section ends with a buildup of spacing to match the climax of the chorus. I won't continue through the next half of the song because this is already way too much, but trust me, it expresses the song with gameplay in mind just as effectively as the first part, and I only mentioned what I found most interesting here. So why does any of this matter? What I'm trying to get across is that this map may be controversial, but behind its absurdity is something only a select few mappers could possibly create. It's a map that's clear with all its intentions, allowing someone like me to extrapolate reasons behind object placements just by looking at it. And at the same time, it's interesting. It's something that I don't see every day, both in unranked and ranked maps. I can't say the same about every controversial map making its way to the ranked section though, and I think that's just because this map is, well, it's comparatively good. A solid chunk of ranked maps come from mappers with an established reputation because they know what they're doing, unlike the vast majority of unknown mappers who may be on the right track but aren't quite there yet. Whether or not a map is checked and promoted by beatmap nominators doesn't have to do with its creator. The map is all that matters. Because Horiuchi's map is so clear with its purposes behind object placements, a few brave beatmap nominators recognized its impressiveness and chose to promote it to the ranked section. The map is what convinced convinced them, not the famous name backing it. As another example, I got a message from this Disco DSCO guy a while back asking me to check out his map. I didn't know who he was and I hadn't seen any of his previous maps, but I decided to give this one a short look anyway, expecting it to be nothing notable, and everything just clicked. The map was great despite breaking conventions of ordinary maps, and I took part in its nomination process because of that. A few weeks later, it made its way to the top of the monthly mapping spotlights as the best map of the month. Who is Disco? DSCO? I don't know his name. In the mapping community at the time, he was nobody special. He had 0 ranked maps, and so he appeared to be just another guy asking for a mod. His map, however, was clearly something special, and it was therefore treated as such. Once again, the name of a mapper isn't important. It's the content that they create which allows them to find beatmap nominators and push maps forward. I wish that were the truth. I really do, but unfortunately, things aren't so black and white. The concern about beatmap nominators prioritizing known mappers is true because acting otherwise is most of the time impractical. Like I just said, this guy messaged me about modding his map, and that probably made a lot of you think, oh man, an opportunity. Now I gotta message pishifat to get some of those free mods for my top tier map. I can tell you now though, that's not gonna work. If I'm swamped with modding requests, as every other beatmap nominator is too, I'll be more inclined to check out maps from people whose names I recognize. If I see a map from these guys whose names I can't pronounce, I have some expectations in mind. I know each of their maps will have clearly understandable reasoning behind every object placement, because their previous maps did. However, if I see a map from a random nobody, my expectations are lowered. It could be decent, but more likely than not, it's gonna be worse than maps from any names I recognize. Like, mapping contests make this pretty obvious. The winners of almost all mapping contests are well-known mappers, yet their entries are judged anonymously. Nobody can say, oh, the name here, that must mean this is a good map. There are no names. To avoid wasting time, I'd probably choose maps from people whose names I recognize in my massive number of requests, and I'm sure some other beatmap nominators function under the same mindset. It is unfair, the claims are partially right, but I still want to make it clear that being an unknown mapper is not completely hopeless. Not every beatmap nominator will ignore every map from an unknown mapper, despite what claims may cause people to believe. I mean, I just gave you an example of that. And a modding queue I'm a part of could be one as well. If a beatmap nominator does see a solid map, they won't avoid it just because the mapper isn't famous yet. A map is judged based on its own merits, and those who say otherwise might just not have a map up to standard. Sorry. Anyway, I hope you get what I mean. Make a good map and you'll be rewarded, even if nobody knows you. Eventually. It takes time and luck, but rushing it's not gonna help. Thanks to these guys for supporting this video, and I'll see you next week.